Alrighty, so here we are, lesson 7. We're now in part 3 of the destruction of Jerusalem. I tried to use my proverbial crystal ball last week at the end to try and tell you how much I thought we may or may not be able to include, and it turns out that I didn't want to run the risk of going over our allotted time, so we are dividing what would have originally been this week, and the siege of Jerusalem itself and the fall of Jerusalem will be the specific focus next lesson in part 4 of the destruction of Jerusalem, so that we're not bombarded with too much volume of information here in this lesson. So, for those obviously who've been following through, we're now continuing into the destruction of Jerusalem and focusing specifically today upon the campaign of Vespasian. In the previous lesson we covered the campaign of Cestius Gallus, or just simply the campaign of Gallus, and the disaster that was ultimately very successful in the beginning, but then due to a series of events which were unfortunate for the Romans, including an act of divine providence in the army, although having surrounded and invested Jerusalem, then inexplicably ending the siege and fleeing to the west, were then chased down by rebel Judean forces and were vanquished at the Battle of Beth Horon. The Roman Aquila was lost disgracefully in the midst of that battle and chaos, and Gallus barely managed to escape back up north into the province of Syria. We saw that it was an incredible disgrace to the people, and particularly to the Roman emperor himself. This is something that was deeply, deeply disturbing across the empire, and the reverberation of this was felt all around. And so at that point, Emperor Nero realised that total war was the only viable option left to be able to crush the rebellion and to restore the glory of Rome, and to, more importantly, restore confidence across the empire after this momentous and infamous defeat at the hands of these rebels in this far-off province in the eastern parts of the empire. The Emperor Nero then, along with the Senate, appoint Vespasian, who I pointed out last week is the future emperor of Rome, and we'll talk about that more. It comes up by the time we get to the end of this afternoon's lesson. And they appoint Vespasian to then bring what is the wrath of Rome down upon Judea and upon Jerusalem particularly. Now, the difference that lies between his predecessor in this campaign, or this attempt and this war, that of Gallus, versus himself, is quite tantamount. Gallus was a legate, a governor from Syria with relative experience, but in terms of warfare was nothing that anyone would ever write home about. That is not the case with Vespasian. Vespasian is, by this point, a mature, wise, and more importantly, militarily accomplished leader with reputable resume in regards to commanding the Roman legions. And so they're not just sending anyone in. It's a very intentional decision on the part of Nero and of the Senate to send, of all people, Vespasian. And that the felt reality of that will become very apparent to us by the time we roll through this, and then especially into the next week as well. But so what we have for us, and just to give you an idea, I think it's in figure 4 in your handouts on page 5, I believe. This is just simply a bust or a statue of Vespasian himself. Again, keeping in mind he's not emperor at this point, but he will become the emperor in AD 69, and we'll cover that more later by the end of the session. So, Vespasian arrives in the eastern province of the empire. He arrives at the helm and in command of the 10th Legion Fretensis, as well as the 5th Legion Macedonia. And he arrives specifically at Ptolemy, which is also known as Acca. We'll get onto that just momentarily later with a particular map and showing you where that is. But in command of the 10th Legion and of the 5th Legion, and he is also then joined by his son Titus, also future emperor, who then sails particularly and specifically up from Alexandria, Egypt, in the Roman province of Egypt. And he arrives in command of the 15th Legion Apollinaris, the warriors of Apollo. What they have here is not just merely one legion like we saw under Gallus, which was the 12th Legion, with kind of cohorts, so subunits of about 500, from an amalgamation of other legions. Right, that force amounted to 30-ish thousand troops. Here we are having a significant heavy force of Roman legions, which of course is including auxiliaries, and they're met at Ptolemy by other auxiliaries from the region as well as other allies like the forces of King Agrippa II. This was the king of the Jews. This is the last Herodian king, nowhere near as competent nor as famous as his predecessor, King Agrippa I, who we have accounted to us in the book of Acts, who reigned from 41 to 44. This is now King Agrippa II, who is the last of the Herodian rulers. He has fled, if you recall your mind back a couple of weeks ago, he has fled during the initial revolt. He's fled Jerusalem and gone up into Syria, into safe Roman territory. He then comes back down to Ptolemy on the coast to Acca and reunites with this invading Roman force. And so instead of one legion with a couple of other cohorts from others, this is 3 full-strength legions plus auxiliaries plus allies, amounting to a total force of over 60,000 troops. Roman military, the Roman army specifically at this time, is we think somewhere in the ballpark of maybe 350-ish thousand, 375,000 troops. We don't know what it was specifically in these days. We know what it was during the reign of Tiberius in 27 AD, and then we know what the number was again under Trajan in 117. And so we kind of pinpoint the middle and say, well, we think it was somewhere between 300,000 earlier this century versus 100 years later where it was 450,000. So we're going to say it's about 350,000-ish. If we use that as a working number, this is nearly 20% of the entire Roman army descending upon Judea and Jerusalem. Okay, I'm saying this, again, not for historical tidbit, I'm trying to show you, A, how seriously Rome was taking this the second time around, and more importantly, I'm trying to show you how big of a dedicated force this was descending down on Jerusalem, because that's where the kind of theological juncture of all this occurs for us. Moreover, the 10th and the 15th Legion, as well as the 5th, but particularly the 10th, were no joke. Very well-trained, battle-experienced, battle-hardened. These were not guys who recently trained or recently enlisted. These were hard units. The unit, particularly, or the Legion, the 15th Legion, which comes up with Titus via ship from Alexandria, were in Alexandria because they were staging for the invasion of Ethiopia. Right, so they were planning to invade Ethiopia to the south of Egypt. So they're already on a war footing. This is a humongous force of very hard battle-experienced warriors that is about to descend upon Jerusalem. Right, so this is no joke for Rome. You won't see it in your handout, but on screen here, it's a map we've referenced before in previous weeks, just showing you that you'll see up in the top left corner an arrow pointing you to Ptolemy. Obviously you can see hopefully the Sea of Galilee. That's up in the region, up in the north where it is. You've got the Dead Sea down in the south, which is where Jerusalem and other cities are. And so they come in at Ptolemy or at Acca, which is on the Syrian side of the border. And that's where the invasion fleet lands specifically. And so it's from there that Vespasian launches his Galilee campaign. Having very kind of quickly crushed the forces in and around Ptolemy, of course, obviously, we then come to a point where specifically, just like Gallus before, he is going to obviously conquer Galilee and those areas of the north. Again, like Gallus, many of the northern cities surrendered without a fight, which made sense. But again, there were still holdouts, particularly by zealot forces up in the north. They again try to put up a fight. It goes just about as well as it did last time, which is where they were very decisively defeated and annihilated by the forces of Vespasian coming from the north. Battles take place, and this is a bit more of a marquee difference. There are a number of battles that take place on the land and the sea, particularly the Sea of Galilee. Josephus accounts for us battles occurring upon the Sea of Galilee, which were as tragic in their results as it was, of course, on the land. Many ships sunk, many bodies splayed in the water, which would just kind of sit there for months and months and months and years to come. It harkens to the kind of phraseology we see where we see in the Olivet Discourse or in Revelation about the bodies of the dead dwelling in the water and the ships being destroyed, and it's speaking obviously to something far more broader than just the physical element. But particularly here you have a type of brutality and of death and of destruction that is surpassing anything that Gallus brought. This is something even more deadly and more dire. And from Josephus' accounting, at the end of that Galilee campaign up in the north, at least 100,000 Jews are dead, and others sold by the Romans off into slavery. So the bodies are piling up very, very, very quickly in this particular instance. And so the Galilee campaign is something which really sets the tone for what then continues to come, particularly by the time we get to the destruction of Jerusalem, which we, as I said, will cover in our next lesson. So beyond this point, he then moves and transitions into the second phase of his war, which is the Judean campaign. All right, so as opposed to Galilee in the north, they now start moving south through to Galilee. And so having crushed those Judean forces in the north, he establishes Caesarea Maritima as his headquarters. Again, we've referenced this plenty of times, but Caesarea Maritima was the headquarters of the Roman government over the previous decades and throughout the first century in the first place. So they reconquer that and they re-establish Caesarea Maritima as their headquarters for then working their way down through the plain of Sharon, like we saw last week, down through to cities like Jaffa. And what they're doing specifically militarily is they're just simply trying to conquer as much land as they can without having to directly attack Jerusalem. They're wanting to wipe up all these other areas of Galilee and Samaria and Judea first, so that they then have eliminated any possibility of Zealot or Judean or even Edomite reinforcements coming from somewhere else while they're trying to attack Jerusalem. And so by the time we get to the spring of AD 68, Roman forces had done a very good job of subduing and taking over and conquering the various Judean and or Zealot kind of fortresses and strongholds throughout Judea and more broadly Samaria. The fighting was horrifically brutal, even by Roman standards, comparatively. The Romans were known for their efficiency in war, but there was an element of drive to truly bring this province to its knees because of the embarrassments that the Romans had suffered from this perspective a couple of months or years now, but a couple of years earlier, over the past 2-3 years. The desire to really send a message here is a big driving force behind not only their tactics but their strategy. And so you see in figure 1, I think it's on page 2 of your notes there, we referenced this map last week. It is specifically giving you, and you can follow the legend or the key on the right side of the map. You can see how this kind of works in terms of the actual territorial progression of the Roman reconquest of Judea. You can see that the light areas like Galilee and even areas like Gamala, or then down in the southwest, which are cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Lod, and Jaffa, the Philistine city-states. Those are conquered well and truly by the time you get through 67 into 68 AD. And so by that point, they've reconquered that. They also reconquer, obviously, all the red areas of Roman Judea. And so then by the time we've gotten into AD 68, you already have a scenario where it's really just these territories in the south, in the kind of dark blue and the royal blue, around Judea and Idumea and whatnot, that's now controlled. So they take back all those other areas, and they're purposefully doing that, as I said earlier, to wipe those forces out, to eliminate any possibility of reinforcements coming down to assist Jerusalem when they finally begin their siege of it. The issue, though, is, as history tends to go, there's usually spanners in the works, that are thrown in the works, except this spanner actually helps the Romans. And so what we end up having in AD 68 is a civil war take place in Jerusalem. You're in the middle of fighting a significant, heavily armed force of the most powerful army that the world has ever seen. And it's in this moment that they very wisely decide to actually engage in a civil war amongst themselves. This is, for all kinds of reasons, again, keeping in mind this whole ordeal is a judgment upon Jerusalem, and this is nothing more than the further implications of this kind of judgment. And so what we end up seeing in this civil war is the following details. The surviving zealot forces, right, the radical end of the rebels against Rome, if they've survived, the handful that have survived, they've fled back down to Jerusalem by this point, okay, because the Romans are just on a tear. Having then now fled, of course, this naturally ends up creating significant socio-political turmoil in Jerusalem specifically. Does that make sense? You have, keeping in mind, we saw this last week, the Judean provincial government is the government that's ruling. So this is being run, and Jerusalem and the whole war ultimately is being led, but particularly on a governmental level, by the Judean provincial government, which is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay, they're the more moderate end of this spectrum. Down the other end of the spectrum, you've got the violent, revolutionary, radical end, and these factional groups, these very heavily nationalist, factionalist groups, like the Zealots, the Sicarii, which we explained in previous weeks. The Sicarii were named so because they carried a Sicarius, which is a type of dagger, right? They were assassins. The Zealots, the name should be pretty obvious what that means, and other such groups like that. Now you have them all in Jerusalem, the more moderate Pharisees and Sadducees, being run by, obviously, the Sanhedrin and everyone else, and then these more radical factions. Differences of views on politics, differences of views on what it even means to be a Jew, differences of views on theology and politics, like military strategy, of course. It's a melting pot of elements that do not mix. And this ends up spilling over and reaching a particular boiling point. The issue with the Zealots and the Sicarii and the more radical groups of the war is the fact that they, even despite any particular military analysis, consistently wanted to take the fight to the Romans. Obviously their victory, because the Zealots are the ones who largely led the victory at Beth Horon. The victory at Beth Horon gave them perhaps a false sense of security in regards to their own ability to defeat the Romans. We don't quite know, but nonetheless, they were consistently wanting to take the fight, and they were willing to kill whomever, wherever, whenever, in order to do that. They were perfectly happy to die, all these various things. That's why we call it the radical end of the spectrum, or the more radicalist groups. The issue is, as I said, more moderate, or comparatively moderate, Judean provincial government run by Pharisees and Sadducees who are wanting to be more tempered and more calculated, to be more moderate, hence the term. This doesn't suit the Zealots, nor the Sicarii, nor any of the other kind of groups that we end up encountering. And so we consistently find, certainly from 68 through 69, and then definitely in AD 70, during the siege and the fall of Jerusalem, you're going to see that next week, this one thing that the Zealots do, which just about determines their fate. We'll say that for next time. But they have to really push the people to actually fight. And so these radical factions like the Zealots in Jerusalem, they are robbing people, they're abusing people, they're even executing at times Jewish civilians or even soldiers who refuse to take the fight to the Romans. It's a bloodbath in Jerusalem anyway. And they were killing people just even for advocating the idea that maybe we should surrender to the Romans. This all ends up reaching a kind of proverbial climax, and a particular climactic confrontation in the form of what we call the Zealot Temple Siege. The Zealot Temple Siege. And so let's dive into that very briefly. Then you'll see how this kind of factionalism and the kind of divisiveness and all the death and all just the ridiculousness that comes from this speaks to this element of judgment. So we end up having a scenario where the more radical factions like the Zealots and the Sicarii, in alliance to the Edomites, which I'll reference a bit later, fight against the Judean provincial government themselves, right? So the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Zealot forces end up, well, they were headquartered in the temple complex anyway, and they were using that for their base of operations. They end up being confined to the temple complex by the Judean forces, so the government forces, in other words, and there's a standoff over this issue, hence why we call it the temple Zealot siege. Representatives from either side, and we're not going to bore you with names because sometimes the names can start to kind of tally up and become a bit confusing here and there. But the Judean government forces largely incite just your average civilian to start rising up against the Zealots and to drive them out, right? The Pharisees and the Sadducees don't want to be aligned with the Zealots and the Sicarii and blah, blah. And the Zealots and the Sicarii and others don't want to be aligned with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? So there's inherent division among the Jews already, and has been throughout this whole war, but particularly by the time we get to this kind of climactic setting. And as I said, they retreat back into the inner court of the temple complex, and are kind of trapped there, so to speak. What the Zealots then do is they then decide to secretly send their own envoy out to the Edomites, south of Jerusalem, to provide reinforcements. Okay, so they're going to, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, to come and raid Jerusalem and to provide them with backup. I mean, the theological implications and consequences of that should be fairly obvious to anyone familiar with the story of Jacob and Esau. But calling on the Edomites, the Idumeans as they were known in the Latin, calling on the Edomites is just a disastrous theological move. But militarily it made perfect sense, which is why they did it. And so the Edomites end up marching a force of about 20,000 troops north up to invade and besiege Jerusalem. The factionalism should be just blindingly obvious in all of these details. And so it's during the night that the Zealots end up managing to successfully open the gates of Jerusalem, and the Edomites rush in, and it's just an absolute slaughter. As far as we can tell from Josephus, at least 6,000 troops are killed in action, plus an unknown quantity of kind of mass civilian casualties, of just, as it's just civilians. The Judean government subsequently collapses, and the radicals end up retaking power of the city. What's interesting to note, though, is the kind of reasoning, like, why did this occur? Okay, you'll see it in your notes there on page 3, about halfway down the page, that the way that the Zealots actually convinced the Edomites to march upon Jerusalem was essentially through a lie, or what we'd kind of call in military political terms a false flag. They told the Edomites that Ananus ben Ananus, who was the leader of the Judean provincial government, right, one of the most important figures thus far on the Jewish side of this war, they told the Edomites that ben Ananus, and more importantly the Judean government, had actually sent envoys to Vespasian to have negotiations, right, of surrender, right? So this is what we call false flag operation. And so they lie to the Edomites, hence why the Edomites march up on the city. The Edomites find out after all of this, and as far as we're told by Josephus, they repent and go home. What's fascinating about this theologically is you have Jews in the city who have brought in Edomites, the nations, right, sons of Esau, to conquer Jerusalem and to enact an absolute massacre of at least 6,000 troops, plus who knows how many mass civilian casualties, overthrow their other Jewish partners in the war. They viewed them that way, but that's what they kind of were, Pharisees, Sadducees, and then the Zealots, Sicarii, everyone else. And then at the end of the day, and keeping in mind also, by the way, the Herodians, so the Herodian dynasty, they were Idumeans, they were Edomites, which was already the problem anyway, because you've got Edomites ruling over Jerusalem and Judea. And then at the end of the day, it's the Edomites who end up repenting of the whole thing because they were brought there under false pretenses, and they leave. And meanwhile, the Jews keep on fighting and keep on factionalizing and all this stuff. It's such an obvious judgment, like the theological workings here, that God's just kind of bringing together in all of this in judgment against the city that crucified the Christ is staggering. But as a consequence, Judean provincial government collapses that ran the show from kind of AD 66 to 68, and now the radical factions led by the Zealots, they're now in charge, and they're now leading the war from 68 through to the collapse and the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And so it comes to the kind of last section of what we're looking at here today, which is particularly and specifically the year of the four emperors. It's what we refer to it in history as the year AD 69, the year of the four emperors. And it has implications not only for our reading of various texts, but also for our understanding of particularly the place of Vespasian and Titus in this whole affair, because this is where their impact really starts to become important for what we read in the scriptures specifically. So in the year of the four emperors, as I said, it's AD 69 is the year. And so what occurs in this particular year, just a brief context, the Emperor Nero by this point has completed his descent into utter madness in AD 68, kind of late AD, mid to late AD 68. Nero had reigned from AD 54, and we'd seen that in previous weeks. He is the monstrous tyrant and easily the single worst emperor in the history of Rome, bar none. One of, if not the single worst ruler in the history of the world, bar none. A truly evil man that had been turned over by God to evil and to darkness. He was referred to by his own people, the Romans, as the beast. That word comes up a number of times, but that word was something that was used by the Romans to refer to him in the first place. He was famous for his persecution against the Christians in the 60s AD, leading right up even to his death in mid AD 68. He didn't invent the technique, but he was definitely the biggest proliferator of what's called the Roman candle. The Roman candle is a euphemistic form of torture and death where you would crucify an individual and or tie them to a stake, one or the other, and then you would set them on the cross alight. Right? You would set them on fire. And he was famous for holding garden parties at the imperial palace for the Senate and for the aristocracy, and the pathways of the path were lit by people crucified or tied to a stake and being burnt alive. He was truly animalistic, and so when I say his descent into madness, that's not me kind of being poetic. It really truly was. It's a descent into madness that made the madness of Nebuchadnezzar II pale in comparison. As judgment against Nebuchadnezzar II, if you recall, back during the Babylonian exile, he was told specifically that he would descend into an almost animalistic madness and dwell among the beasts of the field. This is that just on steroids. Nero, as far as we know historically from a variety of sources, primary and otherwise, would hold again these events where he would take Christians, tie them to a stake, like to a pole, that is to say. He would strip them naked. He himself would then strip naked and then be cloaked in an animal garb of some kind, be it bear, wolf, occasionally things like leopard as well from Africa. And he would then go into an ecstatic frenzy, either through intoxication or other means, and then would start physically tearing pieces off of the Christian and eating it. So he was cannibalistic in that sense. He had already murdered many of his family members. He was so I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, it really is actually difficult to find a single individual, let alone ruler, who was more categorically evil and demonic than Nero. It really, you will be hard pressed to the point of impossibility. This results in even the rest of the Romans going, well, this has gone a bit too far. And so he ends up being declared an enemy of the state by the Senate. And shortly after that, on the 9th of June, AD 68, Nero commits suicide, which is, of course, probably the most apt way for someone like that to go out, which is self-murder. This obviously causes a succession crisis. Not that they knew it was going to be that, but a succession issue is what they then had on their hands. Civil war broke out immediately in Rome and as well as across the empire, particularly the western parts of the empire. And they fall into a state of unprecedented instability and conflict and turmoil, worse than what they'd experienced in the days of the civil wars prior to Augustus, in the days of Julius Caesar. Those ultimately paled in comparison to this kind of uncertainty that now befell, like a meteor upon Rome. And so what we end up having is this division essentially of the empire. You'll see that there. It's in figure 3 on page 5 of your notes. I'm not going to go through it specifically, but you can read through it later. But you'll see there a key or a legend in the bottom left corner. As the AD 69 is referred to as the year of the 4 emperors, because simply enough, it was a year in which Rome had 4 emperors. Not terribly complex. After Nero's death in June of AD 68, Galba, who, if my memory serves me correctly, was governor of the province of Hispania in the western part of the empire, so Spain, he ends up being the one appointed by the Senate to the Imperium. So he becomes emperor. That lasts through about 6-ish months to early January, 15th of January AD 69, where he is then assassinated, I believe specifically by the Praetorian Guard, so the Imperial Roman Guard. I've mentioned before that about half of the Roman emperors approximately were assassinated one way or the other, usually by the Praetorian Guard, which is the elite imperial guard of the emperor's house, because they were a political entity in and of themselves. Otho then comes to influence and comes to power upon the throne. He was more influential in Gaul, which is what today is modern France, and his tenure lasts all of about 4 months before he himself then is rather quickly dispatched as well. Vitellius comes to the Imperium on the 19th of April, AD 69, but by this point now, in the east, over on the war front, Vespasian and more importantly his troops have found out as to the rapid succession of emperors that's been going on, right? That now they're in their 3rd emperor. By the time you get to April of AD 69, their 3rd emperor in about 10 months. You can surely, hopefully see why 3 emperors in 10 months is not exactly conducive to political or cultural stability. It's in fact the opposite. Even though you had emperors that had reigned for short time periods, those short time periods thus far in the 1st century were still at least a couple of years, not a couple of months. And so this is just a disaster. And we know from 1st century sources that you had people around the empire that were basically throwing their hands up and going, this is it. Empire's over, world's collapsing, this is the end of the world. It was a disaster. Wars were breaking out, of course, when you have such kind of political instability and this kind of, especially at this level, imperial, fractionalism. Other lesser magistrates, legates and governors and other such things, Roman generals or centurions, opportunistic as people often are, take it upon themselves to try and make a power move or a power play. That was going on left, right and centre all over the empire. This was just a train wreck, and people thought, this is the end of the empire, this is the end of the world, this is all collapsing down around us. They'd already kind of been feeling that throughout the previous decades anyway, but this was now the last straw, so to speak. And so it's on the 1st of July, AD 69, that Vespasian's troops in the east declare him emperor. Okay. Along with that, you had Roman army forces, legions up in the Danuban provinces. So the Danube is the river that runs kind of through the Balkans and in the east. You'll see it there in a purplish colour, the same kind of colour you see down in Judea and Egypt, okay, they independently declared Vespasian to be the emperor. They then invade across the Adriatic Sea and invade the province of Italy, the Italian peninsula, and they march on Rome, all the while Vespasian himself, having been crowned crowned, not that they thought it was crowned, what we would say is crowned, having been appointed emperor by his own forces, he leaves and he sets sail back to Rome to go and secure and make his fight to become emperor. Okay, and so this is all occurring, right? So the year of the four emperors, because between the 9th of June 68 to the 1st of July 69, you've now got four guys, right? Galba, Otho, and then Vitellius and Vespasian at the same time, those last two, who are now going to fight for the imperium, okay? And so he is supported by those legions from Judea, Syria, Egypt, and as I mentioned earlier, the Danube. And so this sets up this kind of big climactic fight that ends up coming down the pike. These I've decided to include it there as well. The figure 2 on page 4. These are the aurae, right? So the gold coins of those four emperors during their tenure. The Roman mint would have been very busy trying to get these four. And again, I'm not going to talk about it much. You can look at it on the graph. But from the top left, clockwise, it runs through those four emperors: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. So you can look at that more in due course, as well as those particular dates which you're finding there on page 4 of the various successions through the year of the four emperors. And this sets up this stage for this kind of climactic civil war between Vespasian and Vitellius. And again, this is the first time that Rome has fallen into civil war since about this time, 100 years prior. This is exactly what the 1st century BC looked like. The Julio-Claudian dynasty from Julius Caesar / Augustus down to this point has been a time of stability, and now they've descended right back into civil war and into chaos, which is just disastrous for the empire. So Vespasian's supporters invade Italy, they take Rome, and particularly those forces from the Balkans, the provinces of the Danube. They defeat Vitellius and they kill him. Vespasian's obviously arrived by this point. And the Senate, therefore, almost essentially as last man standing, they then appoint Vespasian and proclaim Vespasian to be the emperor on the 21st of December AD 69. Okay? And he is a unifying force. He brings stability back because he then reigns for the next 10 years. Right? And he reigns from AD 69 to AD 79. This is the end of Vespasian's proverbial story in the Judean campaign. Okay, the year of the four emperors ends up causing, because of Vespasian leaving and going back to Rome to try and secure the emperorship, the imperium, it causes a relative lull in AD 69. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't like it was a ceasefire, not by any means, but there was a comparative lull, especially compared to 67 and definitely 68. There was a comparative lull in 69. But like a rubber band stretched out too far, the rebound that we're going to see next lesson in AD 70 makes what we've seen thus far throughout this war look like a bunch of kids playing around with toy soldiers in the sandpit. With Vespasian having departed Judea to claim the imperium, he naturally places his son Titus in command of the war. Okay, Titus himself is young. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly his age at this point. I need to go back and consult some of those primary sources, but he's around my age, so in his 20s, late 20s. But he's already a reasonably well skilled and equipped commander. Again, keeping in mind he came here from Alexandria in the Roman province of Egypt, in command of the 5th Legion, Apollinaris, which was already staging to invade Egypt. Right? He is a skilled commander in his own right, even at that age. And the things that we're going to see him do in the siege of Jerusalem will be of vital importance to understanding what ultimately, the biggest picture, is the break, right? The conclusion of the Old Testament period as we think of it, the old covenantal period definitively. Again, the new covenant has already begun by this point, but the whole reason why this century is so climactic and is such a unique century in history is because it is the very juncture in history where the end of the old and the beginning of the new are overlapped for this time period, and particularly for this generation. Keeping in mind that these things are descending upon Jerusalem and Judea, specifically because Christ himself said that upon this generation would this great judgment befall, the generation that killed the Messiah and the city thereof. And so we're going to see that particularly kind of by the time we get to the siege of Jerusalem, which we'll cover in the next lesson, and see some of the actions that particularly of all people Titus do. We'll see the Roman Aquila becoming an important part again. We saw that in last week's lesson on the campaign of Gallus, where the Aquila, the battle standard, the golden eagle, the battle standard of the Roman legion, the 12th Legion lost their Aquila, which was a disgrace, and was the first time that it had happened since the famous, or the infamous really, Battle of Teutoburg Forest in AD 9. But then the golden eagle, the Roman Aquila, is going to become a very important feature by the time we get to that siege next week. So that therein is the end of this afternoon's lesson. We'll jump into part 4, which will be specifically focused on the siege, and that is where you'll really see, I know I mentioned it last week in anticipation of this week, but I'm now saying it again in anticipation of next week. That is where we will encounter the gruesome details of that judgment befalling Jerusalem, as God, as he had done before with the Babylonians and other such people like the Assyrians, is wielding the Romans here as his instrument in judgment against those who crucified him. So, the end. Does anyone have any questions or comments about today's particular substance of Vespasian and the campaign of Vespasian? Good. Alrighty, we'll end it there. We'll return next lesson with part 4, the final part of the destruction of Jerusalem, and looking specifically at the siege and the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So, thank you.